I like your. I would say I like your blue dress, but I like your yellow water bottle.
Oh, thanks.
That really stands out.
This is great. I wasn't sure. I thought it was gonna be like too bulky, but it's like it keeps the water like cool and everything nice.
Yeah.
That's great.
And you're through the budgets and.
Ah, yes. Yeah, we are. We are.
Oh.
Yeah. So, how was your trip?
Oh, it was fine. You know, I was only gone 4 days.
Oh, you were?
It was
Oh.
not like we. It was. It just happened to be exactly, and we were.
Yeah.
We were going with my daughter in New Mexico, who, and her little kid.
Yes.
That's when she needed us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, what do you do?
Yeah.
So I know it was not a. You know,
Okay.
It wasn't, like I was
It wasn't
gone.
necessarily like a
No, it wasn't some
like
big
a 3-week
romantic-
cruise where you
no,
got
no,
to
no,
tour
no,
the
no,
world
no,
and
no,
yeah.
no, yeah. It was and that was that weekend when it was 80 in Portland, beginning of May. It snowed there.
Oh. So you missed out.
Unbelievable.
Wow.
Yeah,
In New Mexico?
yeah.
Does she live up towards Dallas?
She's in Los Alamos, which is very high.
Yeah.
But I mean, even for them, you know, snow in May is not
Yeah.
like no. But it was fine. Yeah. Yes, I was doing part of my early childhood work.
Allocation Committee meeting for June 3rd. I'm Ted Wheeler. I'm the mayor of the city of Portland and the chair of the Allocation Committee. I'd also like to introduce my committee colleagues. On my left is Multnomah County Commissioner Jessica Vega-Peterson. And seated next to her is Felicia Tripp-Folsom, who's our county-appointed member. Good afternoon. And on our right is Julie Young, and she was appointed by the city of Portland. And of course, Mitch Harnaker is our business community representative way over on the far right. The PCL staff is here in full force. We have Lisa Pellegrino, Meg McElroy, Lisa Hansel, Mary Gay Broderick, and John Coughlin are all here today. And before we get started, I'd like to take a motion to approve the minutes of the May 13th meeting. Can I get a motion and a second, please?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any disagreement on that? Without objection, the May 13th meeting minutes are approved. Next, we open the floor to public comment items on things that are not on today's agenda. Just a reminder, we'll have 4 additional opportunities during this meeting for public testimony on items that are on the agenda. But if anybody has anything they'd like to share that's not on today's agenda, now's the time. Anybody care to speak? I do not see anybody rushing to the microphone. So to kick things off today then, we have a video by John Coughlin on the LifeWorks Northwest Children's Relief Nursery. And this has been a long-time Levy partner and familiar to many of us in the room. Good afternoon, John. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you very
Excellent.
much. It's a real quick video, yes, about the Children's Relief Nursery at LifeWorks. It's, the Children's Relief Nursery is one of the 15 child abuse prevention and intervention programs supported by the Levy currently.
Charlie is my son. He's almost 2 years old. He loves to sing. He loves to play with his friends. He likes to play with his sister and bother her a lot. His sister is 4, Colby. Charlie's been a part of the Relief Nursery since he was born.
We're a program of LifeWorks Northwest, and we serve young children ages birth through 5 in this child abuse prevention program. We have children and families that come from high-stress situations with lots of risk factors in their lives. And so we really try in our therapeutic classrooms to have it be a calm, safe environment. We work with the whole family on home visits, and we're particularly working on educating parents and helping them reduce stress in their life.
The stress relief that I get from being able to send Charlie to the Relief Nursery is amazing. Being able to have the kids somewhere safe where I know that they're learning, socializing, having a good time during the day gives me the opportunity to grow. It gives me the opportunity to be able to think about what I want to do for my future.
So we've been a grantee of the Children's Levy ever since 2002, and you add up at about 150 children per year. That's literally probably thousands of families and children that we have touched.
It's just really helpful to know that I have support in different areas of my life. So I'm an addict, so I have like treatment, I have therapy, I have all these different, but to know that like I have it in an area that's specifically for my children is super helpful. LifeWorks saved my life. LifeWorks was my residential, my outpatient, the relief nursery for my children. I love LifeWorks.
Very good. Thanks, John, for showing
you,
that.
John.
And thank you to everyone at the Children's Relief Nursery for the fantastic work you do in our community to support and empower the development of strong and healthy families throughout the community. So thank you for sharing that video with us today. So our first official agenda item has Lisa Pellegrino providing additional information on program area strategies. As you'll recall, colleagues, we asked her to come back last month and come back to the May meeting and tell us a little bit more about it. And I want to be clear that the staff is still seeking community input on this item via SurveyMonkey and email. We're not going to be voting on anything regarding this today. We're going to hold off until the June 17th meeting. So if somebody is watching or listening, that would be the time to come to City Council chambers and be heard. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So please make your voices heard if you've got something to say. Links to the survey and the email will be included in the meeting recap mailed to the database tomorrow, and as well in the monthly newsletter that goes out on Friday. And of course, these are always available on the Children's Levy website as well. So we encourage everybody who has a voice to be heard on this to be heard. Lisa, take it
Indeed.
away.
Okay, so we wanted to get follow up with our previous discussion on strategy. So if you recall, just to take you back, and I know Julie wasn't here last time, we put out the draft strategies that are based on the community engagement input and also based on the local data that we gathered, showing results for and outcomes for children and caregivers in the region, and on best practice. So the strategies kind of come out of that landscape of items. We gave you the draft strategies last time, and we had a request to talk about how they compared to the strategies we had in 2014. And so we've got a attachment on the memo that does that comparison for you all, and there is the same attachment is available to the audience on one of the sheets so people can follow along. It's a lot of information to put on a slide, so I didn't put it back on a slide because it's hard to read. So it's probably best to follow along that way. And I wanted to address what some of the differences were, and to set that stage, to remind you that when Kiyoshi Owens was here presenting the community engagement report, she specifically said there was not a huge change in the types of services that people were asking for. Some changes, but not a huge change. But there were differences in how those services are delivered, the quality level of the services that people sought, and who's delivering those services. So a little bit different emphasis, I think, and then we tried to kind of hit on that with the features that you see in the full strategy explanations. So to briefly recap what is different, just so folks can, and hopefully Mitch, this met what you were looking for and understanding what was different. In early childhood, the draft strategies for the next Levy reflect the community engagement input to allow a broader range of models and removes some of the age group limitations on the strategies that we had had before. In child abuse prevention, there's more of a focus on child development. It also, the current strategy, the new strategy, includes the previous strategies, but also opens it up to new approaches and adds a strategy focused on supporting families in crisis and preventing neglect, which specifically was highlighted in the community engagement feedback. In foster care, there was an added strategy to support foster parents. Go for it. Yes, interrupt at any time.
So do you want to take questions as you go through this thing, or do you want to just
I'm happy to
plow through it
pause
do
and-
a presentation, or what do you want to do?
I don't have a preference, so if you want to interrupt and do questions, go right ahead.
Mr. Mayor, do you have a preference?
Go for it.
So on early childhood,
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned and you indicate that we have removed the age limitation. Can you explain what that means?
I'll let Meg do that.
Yeah, thought I would come help, just in case. In the previous strategy, the home visit, there were three strategies: home visiting, preschool or preschool-like experiences, and early childhood mental health consultation. The home visiting strategy was exclusively for prenatal to age 3, and the preschool strategy was exclusively for ages 3 to 5. That preschool strategy included what we called preschool-like experiences, which were sort of more like parent-child groups that addressed preschool-type themes and development. But we wanted to, after understanding community engagement input this time, remove those age restrictions on the strategies to open it up so that parent-child type group focused programming could be available for parents of children younger than age 3. And also so that we could think about how to include early learning settings that also serve children under the age of 3. So, does that help?
Yep. Thank you.
Other questions? I don't want to rattle on with, okay. So in foster care, just returning to that one, I'm really highlighting what the differences are here from before, so that's kind of where I'm coming from. We added a strategy to support foster parents specifically, which was not included before, and that really came out of the community engagement results. It was a strong theme. And we broadened the strategy focus to specifically highlight culturally relevant approaches and broader range of models available for people to propose. And after school, minor changes, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
If I look down at my paper, I can't see you.
So I'm interested in the focus or changing a strategy to support or train or work with foster parents. If we haven't been doing that previously, we've been putting our money, spending our money on services direct to the foster child. So I guess I have a question about how big of a, have we thought about how big this problem is in terms of training foster parents? How much money we're going to take away from direct service to foster kids and move to training of foster parents? And is there a rationale for how we are going to get to that?
All very good questions.
So we don't know what the dollar amount would be yet. I think that the phrasing, taking money away from children in foster care, they're being supported by
Right.
the foster
Yeah, that
parents,
was
right?
probably
So
a bad
it's,
choice
I
of
think
use
it's
of words.
similar to in child abuse prevention intervention where we have parenting support as a strategy. This would be similar to that is how I see the foster parent support. And the last time we did the public engagement before the 2014 round, training and support for foster parents was also something that was highlighted, but at that time felt that that was really a DHS responsibility. And this time also had conversation, in addition to the community engagement, also had conversation with DHS managers. And there really does seem to be a role for community support for foster parents as well. And balancing would need to be very coordinated with DHS because DHS does have specific roles around training and expectations for foster parents. But there certainly is a role for community-based services to support foster parents as well. And, with the DHS audit that came out last year, it really shows that there is a huge need for supporting foster parents. There's such a shortage of foster parents. You've read articles about kids being placed out of state and in hotels. So there's really a need to raise the respect that foster parents received and the support that they received to be able to work with and care for the children who are in foster care and support them in understanding how to provide trauma-informed environment for the children in their care.
Yeah, I'm not questioning the need, and clearly every foster parent is taking care of a foster child, which means there's a direct relationship to spending resources on training the foster parents. I'm just kind of interested in direct service to programs supporting the child versus the parents, and you answered why we would do it. I understand that. The question is, how big is that need? What is the shortage in DHS training? Have we analyzed where that is, or is it in a particular type of training? I just feel like it's just such a broad category. When we get proposals in, I'm just wondering how we're going to filter them or understand which ones are addressing the largest gap in current available training and which ones aren't, for instance.
As part of, with the review panels that review the foster care applications, we'll have DHS representatives as reviewers on those panels, so they can help with some of that in terms of saying, well, this is something that we already do, or this isn't much of a need. I would be asking them to give that kind of feedback. Additionally, what I've heard from DHS management, there's a real need for support of foster parents when they're challenged with specific behavior of a child in their home, and there's not somebody that can go and be there and provide that kind of support, like a home visiting kind of service, intensive home visiting that really helps with addressing behaviors of children in their care, and really with a focus on if you can understand and address the issues of the children, then the foster parents are less likely to say, I can't do this placement anymore, and so there's less disruption. So that's one of the things, that's an example of something that has been highlighted as a need. Another need of supports around like respite care for foster parents, just to get a break. Having childcare so that they can attend the trainings that are offered by DHS. So a lot of the reasons they can't go to the training is because they don't have anyone to watch the children that they need to care for. So those are just some examples, and it will be a balance of, which of these services seem most important to provide in each of the strategies. I think that's true for all of
For
the
all of them.
strategy, all of the program areas and the strategies. It'll be a balance of which things are best for the levy to invest in.
And I think it's also good to keep in mind that not only are you balancing what are the best investments, but you're also balancing based on the applications that you receive and what you feel the quality of the applications are. And so that's the other piece that is always influencing. So it's not just how much need is there, but who's coming forward to serve it, and are they offering the kinds of things that we think are most important, and did they, convince us that this is a well-thought-out program and going to be well-delivered and well-received. So, it is always a constellation of factors. I think it's that piece, that set of information is one set of information, but you will end up looking at the other sets of information too, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. But we don't have.
There's no
we have one
quantification.
star less in the constellation last time because we didn't say we were going to fund training for foster parents. So adding that, we have a more complex decision to make, which maybe is the right answer, but it is more complex.
I agree, and I think it's come through strong enough both times and from too many sources that I just don't think we can not do it. I guess that's what our collective, I should say, not me personally, but us collective as staff. So that's what drove that, I think.
Right. And since we
That was
haven't,
helpful.
and since we haven't had it as a strategy in the past, we're not even sure how many applicants there might be, how many different kinds of proposals. So that will.
It's hard to gauge
will be
sometimes,
seen.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But a good question. So, and after school, the main change is, or the main addition is a focus on social emotional development, programs that focus on that or that incorporate that somehow into what they're doing after school. That was a major theme in community engagement as well, and that's why it was added. The other things that we did in 2014 and after school would be included in the draft strategy. So it's not as if we couldn't keep funding those things, they're just written more broadly.
So,
Go ahead.
sorry.
No, go for it.
So in 14, we had, quote, intensive academic support. Intensive has been dropped, at least in the form, and I recall that was an important word in terms of how we filtered the applications.
Yes, again, we did consult with different types of people, more policy-heavy stakeholder groups that I think were more driven in that direction, more directive, I guess, kind of input. The literature out there also supports intensive academic interventions as being the ones that are most likely to show outcomes because, of course, the heavier intensity programs are often the ones that are able to show the outcomes just from that intervention, keep in mind, right? The ones that are studied at that level. I feel like what came through on the community engagement this side was the emphases were around how are you providing individualized support? How are you making sure that the ratios are low enough and that there is attention to that individual's academic situation, that was more important, and then how the parent and the school and the community-based provider all are working together, and how are the programs approaching that. Now, that is something that we asked for last time, too. That was one of the other things we asked for, but that was something that really was highlighted, and I felt like we should be putting that in the strategy because people highlighted, it came up in focus groups and it came up in the survey, too. So that's kind of where that came from. I don't know if it would say that people think that there shouldn't be intensive supports. I just think that people want those supports, whether they're intensive or not, done in a certain way.
So why wouldn't we carry intensive forward then?
We could. It just didn't really directly come out of the input that we received, so I didn't add it in there. Do you feel like it should be in there?
I mean, it was something that we used a lot the last go-around to determine which proposal we thought had the best chance of making a difference in children's lives. So it just feels like taking it out, again, broadens the field, makes it more complex and less hard it's one less filter. So personally, I thought it was beneficial to our analysis last time. I have no objection to broadening it, the description, but I thought having intensive in there was positive.
Any other thoughts?
I would probably agree with
I would agree with Mitch that I think there is, how you operationalize intensive is going to be, of course, what it comes down to. What does that look like, as opposed to not having that word there, and does that make a difference in how proposals are scored and so on? But I think it sets a standard that we feel strongly about, that we feel that that for whatever reason, that certain students qualify for academic support, is that we want this to be intensive and as fruitful, beneficial for these youth as possible. So and I know that it doesn't necessarily make sense to use a word just to use a word because it sounds strong, but I also think that it conveys that message. So.
Okay. We'll add that to our feedback. And just to reiterate, our goal is to come back, take your feedback that we're hearing today, and also any other feedback I'll get to that in a second, but other feedback that we hear, and bring that to you all for your final decisions on the 17th. Okay, on mentoring, not a lot of change. The biggest change was broadening the strategy and emphasizing supporting youth development, which came through in community engagement. And mentoring. In hunger relief, the biggest change is that there was specific mention and desire for mobile strategies, mobile food pantries, or food delivery in some case to deal with the transportation and other barriers that are experienced by people trying to access food, or various food resources in the community. And the training and education on food-related topics for youth and adults was a strong theme in community engagement. And although we funded some of that in relation under the alternative approaches strategy we had last time, that was really specifically called out in this set of feedback that we received. So that's why we sort of put that up to a strategy itself. So that hunger relief maybe had the most change in terms of strategies that people wanted, to call out specifically. Although I don't think that anything we were currently doing would fall outside what those strategies are either. So that kind of summarizes where is different. Is that relatively clear to folks, kind of where things have changed? I think what we would, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No worries, no apologies.
Did we talk about child abuse prevention and intervention?
I did, but we can go back to it.
I missed it unless I'm having a senior moment here. We had therapeutic intervention called out in 14, and that's been dropped in the current proposal. Can you talk a little bit about why and whether you see that as a material or significant change?
So I don't know necessarily, it's rephrased as intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk. So it could still certainly include therapeutic intervention as well as other kind of strategies or approaches to lessening harms and preventing future risk. So I would still see therapeutic intervention as fitting within that strategy.
And is that part of trauma-informed care? I mean, that's a phrase we hear a lot of. And so is therapeutic intervention a subset of trauma-informed care? And trauma-informed care is the broader category, or is therapeutic intervention the broader category?
I would say trauma-informed care is a broader category and not limited just to therapeutic interventions.
Okay, and is trauma-informed care carried over into the current proposals?
Yes, we would,
Okay.
being trauma-informed care, I would see as a component of any child abuse prevention intervention and any foster care program that we fund would be an expectation that trauma-informed care is part of the work they do.
And that came through in community engagement for everything, that, people receiving training and being, qualified to think in terms of delivering their program with trauma-informed perspective is key. So I feel like that's running through all kinds of program setting, not even just programs for high-risk
Just wanted to make sure.
family. So we did not receive a lot of written feedback, as was said at the beginning of the meeting, and so we'd like the chance to maybe try one more time to see if there's any other feedback out there. If people want, we heard from maybe, would you say 6 people about? Yeah, okay, about 6 folks. So I would like to try one more time to see if there's any other feedback out there. I mean, I do think that we have to be sensitive to the fact that people talk to PSU, people talk to the community engagement consultants. They may be tired of talking about, to the levy, potentially. So I get that, that people don't want to be pestered, but we'll try one more time, at least to move out through our networks to see if there's any last feedback we can bring to you all, and then we'll be asking you to kind of make that final decision at the next time. So are there other questions or input folks want to give at this juncture that we can feed into any redraft we do for you all?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Is there public testimony on this item? Come on up. 3 minutes, and if you wouldn't mind your name for the record, please. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here.
You bet. Thanks for being here.
Community. My name is Jorge Nava. I coordinate a youth program at the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization, also known as IRCO. The program that I run is PCL funded. It's called Inspire, which is the in-school program for immigrant and refugee education. Part of why I'm here is I want to support the prioritization of equity, inclusion, and diversity that the PCL is focusing on, as well as a socio-emotional priority. I'll talk a little bit about IRCO. IRCO is a culturally specific organization, and it provides culturally specific and responsive programming for immigrant and refugees across Portland. My program specifically provides it provides individualized support for youth through academic advocacy, socio-emotional learning, culturally focused academic support, and we also provide after-school activities. The populations that Inspire serves are Latino, Slavic, African immigrant, and Asian and Pacific Islander. And to be more specific about the last two, we provide supports for Bhutanese Nepali and Bhutanese Karen, as well as Somali populations. And I want to point that out because those populations are kind of broad. So again, we want to appreciate the support that the PCL has provided our programming. But because those populations are kind of broad, there are some members of those populations that we want to continue, or we want to be able to provide supports for. That includes the Chickees community throughout Portland, and we also have localized pockets of African immigrants and refugees that need more support, specifically the youth and academics. In our experience, we found that bilingual and bicultural advocates provide very effective support in addressing some of the issues we see. And this is especially important in schools where advocates are the only ones who speak the language or know the culture. So again, I want to thank you for your continued support. We're excited that the levy is prioritizing equity, inclusion, and diversity, as well as socio-emotional supports. And we hope that this will allow for continued and increasing supports for a program like ours. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Come on up. Good
I am
afternoon.
Dr. Joseph Tietz. I'm the Executive Director of the Pathfinder Network and a recipient of PCL funding. I'm just wanted to comment on that last sort of go-around around nomenclature. Particularly, I'm a clinical psychologist. We work with families primarily impacted by the criminal justice system. So trauma-informed approaches are a core central piece of our work, and we take it quite seriously. We get all of our staff trained, and it is a broader term than just therapeutic intervention. Represents not only the whole experience of being engaged in a particular agency, whether that's a police arrest to the waiting room in an office. And it requires training of all staff at a broad level. And I think it has even more significance, quite honestly, than the word intensive, which can mean all kinds of things. But I think that I noted your comment, and I felt like it was important to sort of emphasize that and centralize that in, as Lisa said, almost all approaches to children have to take that into consideration because unfortunately we do more harm than good sometimes by not really addressing the impact of how we deliver services.
Very good. That's one of the great things about this committee and these hearings is we end up with these experts in the room who can tell us this at a fine feathered level. So thank you very much. Who was that masked man?
Can we have him back every meeting?
Absolutely.
We need an expert in the room.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Anybody else like to testify? Very good, then, and again, we're not going to take a vote on this item until June 17th, and there's still plenty of opportunity for people to chime in if they have further thoughts. So Lisa's going to come back up here, and she's going to present changes to the public testimony process. We talked about this a little bit of last time. This, of course, is changes to the process when the allocation committee makes its funding decisions. And we, of course, already had an opportunity to provide feedback to Lisa and the team, and so it's my understanding, Lisa, the expectation is that we will take a vote today on this item. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Very good.
I'm happy to do that first and then revisit. You all had asked for information around outcomes and their connection to the strategies. So before I lead the strategies, I could explain how those things are connected, if that would be helpful, or I can come
Great.
back to that after we do
That would
testimony.
be helpful.
Is
That'd
that
be great.
Okay.
Good.
I wasn't sure what would work best, but, and this is really more of an information. We're not asking for you all to vote particularly on something, but to make sure that kind of we're all on the same page around that. So we talked about last time baseline data, and I wanted to remind folks to please take a look at the local data report, because that does form our basis for how we're looking at outcomes for kids, and that's what is all the data that we're setting in those strategies is coming from that report. So just if we step back, the general accountability framework that we're using is how we built the logic model, if you will, that links the supports that we're funding to the positive longitudinal and community outcomes that we're looking for. So that's kind of how the approach we took. That framework includes assuring that people are enrolling in the programs that we're funding, right? That that we understand the demographics of who enters those programs and who stays in those programs, so that we look at both of those, particularly from race and ethnicity perspective, given lack of racial equity and outcomes. We're trying to understand how many of the kids meet the outcomes, and we're trying to understand how staff turnover may or may not be impacting the relationship basis of the services that we're trying to fund. So that framework does not include longitudinal outcome tracking, because that really requires outside expertise to do. You've got to track kids over time. You've got to pay somebody to do that. And they have to be able to protect the people's data over time and follow them wherever they might go. So those are more complex and costly services or costly types of outcome evaluation to do. It also doesn't include an assessment of the levy's impact on community level outcomes, like, say, the graduation rate, which is a very typical one that people want to look at. And that is for a number of reasons. If you want to look at that to understand what the contribution of the levy is toward those types of outcomes, you need to be able to control for all the other inputs that are helping to produce those outcomes. So you need the type of expertise in study design that we don't have on staff that we would need to hire out. So that's a separate cost, and everything we spend money on that isn't the programming for children is, that's a policy decision to spend money on that, which no one has made that decision in the past. The other thing to keep in mind is just scaling. We're serving, in an annual period, we're serving approximately 12,000 children, which is maybe 10 to 12% of the youth and child population in Multnomah County. So, go ahead.
I noticed you use Multnomah County to establish the percentage of the youth, but Portland Public Schools, do we have a Portland number rather than a Multnomah County number, since we're not a Multnomah County?
The most recent estimates that were available are from Multnomah County. So using ACS, they don't break those. They do it at the big census tenure. They break them down further, but they don't necessarily. I couldn't find it broken down for the city of Portland for a recent estimate. And there's been a lot of population growth, so that's why I didn't use that. For children and youth and certain, you're looking for certain age groups, right? So that's why we use Multnomah County for that. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're funding, because you are responsive grant makers, you are responding to the kinds of things that people are saying that they need and are proposing to deliver in the community. We have the types of interventions that range in intensity. So someone might come to an after-school program that is a total of 8 hours of service in a year, and they may come to a preschool program which is more than 400 hours of service in a year. So you're looking at pretty different amounts of participation that complicate the outcome picture, if you will. So I just wanted to make sure we understood that that's kind of why those things haven't been done, because they are a significant cost and also just scaling issues. We are trying to do some level of monitoring around whether we're working to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in children's well-being and success, which is one of the levy goals that is in the statute that we have to, that we are striving toward. And so in looking at that, we're understanding that about 70% of the children that come into the programs are of color, about 50% of the Portland schools population, so that's basically schools within the city limits, and then some of those districts extend beyond the limits somewhat. About 50% of those kids are of color. And we also look at data to understand, is there any significant disparities in how people are coming into programs versus how long they stay? And we have not, and we've tracked that now for 5 years, there have not been any consistent disparities in the race and ethnicity of the children who are coming in versus the children who are staying and getting measured for the outcomes. And then we've got about 80 to 85% of the kids meeting the outcomes typically at the Levy level. So in that gives you that picture of understanding who are we serving, are they staying, and are they meeting the outcomes that help us understand are the programs doing a good job in trying to change the trajectory for children. But it doesn't go to the level kind of what I think Felicia pointed out last time, was trying to understand, if a kid came into Head Start, what happens to them when they graduate high school? We don't have that level of data on kids. So in addition to that, we're also monitoring and reporting how well we're doing on other investment goals that were set at the beginning of the 2014 round, and that was around investing in more culturally specific programs, more programs that were serving people who reside or go to school east of 82nd, and that we're reporting on to you regularly every year. And those goals, we have made some level of improvement in those goals. The things we have not monitored, kind of to your point, is we have not monitored what is the demographics of the agency staff. We ask for that at the application, but we have not asked for that on an annual basis. And that's something that we could consider doing so that we can understand it goes to the community engagement response around who's serving the children. So that's the piece I think that we're not monitoring that we could monitor. We also have not monitored other equity practices and how well people have done at those, at improving those, like things like service user voice and influence that is important, community accountability practices, which we're trying to ask questions about in the RFI, and language accessibility, for instance. Those are some examples of things that we could monitor that we have not specifically monitored. So I think we could pose to you all to include those things moving forward if we feel that those are important markers for us and how well we're doing at improving equity and diversity inclusion practice overall amongst the people that we're funding. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, some of the demographic data is in the new questions, in the new scoring.
We collected it at the point at which people applied. So we asked that same chart you see there, we asked for all of that data in 2014 as well. But we have not asked for the agencies who eventually received the funding to report that annually. Part of, we're balancing load, so I want to remind people that every time we ask for another monitoring thing, then that's another thing grantees have to do. So, there's always mindfulness there about how much we ask of people. But I think if people feel it's important, then we need to look into doing that. And then giving you all a report every year so you can understand what's happening. And then last, in terms of the levy itself, the staff and the board here, we are now a separate office. We are submitting for the first time an affirmative action plan and an equity plan to the city offices that work on those plans. So we'll be reporting out annually on our own progress as well. So that's kind of, I wanted to give that because I felt like it was missing from the strategies. It was maybe coming too much not from the whole picture. So I'm hoping that helps, but I'm happy if people want other clarification or have questions, I want to make sure to answer those at this juncture. No? Okay. Leaning forward. Other questions or issues on that topic?
Very good.
Okay.
Any public testimony on this item? All right, we're ready for a vote, Lisa.
Okay, now that you don't have to vote on?
We do not.
No,
Okay.
strategies will take over. That was really more information. I wanted to make
Okay,
sure
very
people
good.
felt they had the information they needed and to be able to say, make sure that I was clear even to the public about how we're tracking these things. Testimony, that I need to vote on.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
So at the last meeting, we brought to you different ideas and options for how to follow PSU's recommendations on how to improve our situation with testimony in the decision-making phase. So again, we're talking about the decision-making phase. This is after the applications come in, after they're scored. Now you're charged with making the decisions about who to fund. So how do we do that? How do we best do that? In the past, we allowed oral testimony. People were unsatisfied for various reasons, which we've gone over in the report and in other meetings. Staff ran a bunch of ideas by you all last time. Nobody was interested in testifying in this last time. So I'm working off of what the feedback you all gave us and came up with we as a staff came up with the following recommendations. We are recommending.
Before you jump into that, did you
Yes.
get additional testimony, written testimony?
No, we did not ask for written testimony on this subject through
Okay,
the surveying.
So the feedback you were providing today is based on the feedback we gave earlier?
Exactly.
Got it, okay.
And
So
the-
we are listening, in effect, then, for the accuracy of the feedback we provided.
Exactly.
Got
And then
it.
one member was not there, so.
Okay,
And
good.
you could solicit testimony, if folks want to testify today, we made sure that everybody knew that this would be on this is,
Well, I'll call for that when you're done.
When we're done.
I imagine some people might want.
and you all may not, agree with the staff recommendations, so you may want to put forward something else. So what, on balance, listening to you all, what we came up with was to allow to address the testimony sort of as a package, to allow for written testimony, for everybody to have a chance to respond to staff recommendations. And this is not something that was done in the past. So we would provide a written space, that would be limited to the same space for all, so that people would have equal amount of opportunity to write something. So you can't submit a tome, but provide some response to the staff recommendation or anything else you want to add, kind of a grantee, or rather an applicant comment section. Looks similar, we're imagining would look similar to you all as the format that you looked at for renewals, where you saw the staff recommendation and the rationale, and then you saw how the grantee responded to that. So that's kind of, we would advocate that you all do that, because I think that provides a way that everybody can respond and that you all could actually hear and understand. Around the oral testimony, PSU was recommending 10-minute interviews with, some kind of dialogue with the applicants. There was reservations on the part of the committee for the time commitment, just if we had the same number of applicants, which would be 115, it could be more this time. To your point about broadening strategies, there could be more applicants this time than 115. And that, you're talking a lot of hours. If everybody gets 10 minutes, it's 20 hours. If everybody got 10 minutes at that level, that's, and big blocks of time to listen to testimony for all of you, which was going to be difficult to schedule. And also, if we have to leave that much time for testimony, it's going to push up against other parts of the process, like allowing reviewers more time to review applications, so there's balance there in terms of how you time the whole process. We put forward so we heard those reservations, and staff had a couple of other options that nobody really opined or had many opinions on, which was either to have a testimony listened to by subgroups of you all, one person at a time listening to different testimony, and then trying to figure out some way you all could communicate what you heard. It seems difficult. I'm not sure how we would do that. Could be a lot of meetings with you all, since you can't meet more than 2 people at once. So that was problematic. We also, was there some way to limit testimony, like only certain subgroups of applicants could testify? Folks who were not recommended for funding, or folks who were scored below a certain level in the process, so you could hear from them. I think that's problematic. We all thought that was problematic, because if then some people get a chance to testify and then they get funding, and the people who didn't get a chance to testify don't get funding, that's going to feel unfair to people. So those two didn't seem like great options. We had a suggestion for video testimony last time, and so we tried to work out how we might be able to do that, and we thought that might be worth pursuing. So we're going to recommend that we try that, and as opposed to live testimony, which creates 2-hour blocks of time for you all to try to concentrate. This would allow you, if we did video testimony, would allow you to digest the testimony in whatever amount you can feel like you can listen at a time. You would do it on your own time rather than as a group. I think to make it fair, we felt we should offer, so as to not put resource drain on organizations, that we would offer to do that. John Coughlin has great video skills. He could do the videoing, and we could offer different times and places so people don't have to come downtown to provide that testimony, and then it would be an equal format, so you don't have somebody having more resources to produce fancy things and less people don't have resources for that. Also, submitting testimony that is not governed by our machine. There was a lot of problems with being able to get, if people just submit a video of their own making, it's often difficult to view that in different formats, and so you have a lot of format issues, and this would control for that, so we don't have too much problem with that. I think length of video would be the question. How much do you all have ability to listen to in the time period that we'll have for review? We were thinking 2 to 3 minutes is still probably realistic, just because it's a lot of hours that you have to listen. So that's what we would recommend, willing to hear your opinions. So that's why we imagine testimonies, allowing everybody written testimony, everyone have an option for video testimony. We would provide the resources for that at differing locations and times, hopefully able to accommodate. And also providing interpreters if people requested them, and more time, for people who need interpretation, we provide more time for you to do your video, since you have to say everything twice in essence. So that's kind of the parameters of that recommendation. On advocacy, which was how do applicants contact you, and in what format are they allowed to do that, to advocate for their program once all the applications have been submitted. On balance, we felt that the dissatisfaction people had with the feeling it's unfair because there's different levels of access by different organizations to you all, just by virtue of relationships in the community and the many roles that you all play in the community, that we felt like maybe we would try to treat this more like an RFP, kind of how the mayor suggested, that we, once the application is out, the applicants are no longer allowed to talk to you all about getting funding from PCL, and that would stay that way until the decisions are made. And instead, we would allow these just, the written testimony, in combination with written testimony and an option for oral testimony. That would be the way to communicate to the committee formally, rather than doing the emails or attempting to get you to go for site visits or have meetings or other types of offline communications with applicants. So that was our feeling. I know that there's difference of opinion on the committee, and we're willing to, I think, your all's discussion, and if you want to hear from anyone in the audience, to try to go forward. Any questions about what we're asking or what we're advocating for?
Yeah, I have a couple of things.
Sure, Commissioner.
Thank you. So first of all, I appreciate all the work that you went into and the kind of creative thinking that went into some different options and how to address this issue. And I'm fine with allowing the written testimony. I think that's a really good way to get some response from folks so that they can address, the staff recommendations if there's any questions about that. And also the decision around prohibiting advocacy by applicants. I guess I would just say, just like we have to do in other ways for my job, we're probably still, I can see myself still having to meet with different applicants, but just knowing that the discussion about the PCL application would be off limits in terms of those discussions that we'd be having would be fine with me. In terms of the videos and the, and I appreciate how accessible you're trying to make it by setting it up and providing John to actually do the videos. What would be the difference, right? If they're still only having 2 to 3 minutes to actually have their say in the time, and I know there was some dissatisfaction with that process before. What did you as staff consider the biggest difference in doing it this way versus just having them come down here during a meeting and giving that kind of testimony?
The biggest advantages that we saw were, A, you wouldn't have to listen to it in 2-hour blocks, and so it would be more digestible. So maybe you could really hear it better or differently. We could control and make sure that everyone had the same amount of time, and you could sign up for time ahead of time, so it would hopefully be more convenient and less crazy than when we had people come, and then it's the chair's responsibility to divvy up the time and the people in the moment. So this would be, everyone has a block of time, you could sign up ahead of time, and it would be at locations that don't force people to come downtown, where that most people consider to be fairly inaccessible and a pain in the neck. So those are the main upsides. I don't think it deals with, to your point, it does not change the fact that you're still only getting to provide 2 to 3 minutes of testimony when people wanted a 10-minute interview. It does not address that, and I don't know how to. With the scale that we have, I think it would take a complete and total redesign of everything to try to get to a point of interviewing people, because I think the pool would have to be smaller by that time if you were going to interview folks. And I don't know that this group of people, given the demands on the mayor and you in particular as electeds, to interview candidates at scale like that, that's a lot. I mean, we fund 70, right now we're funding 70 plus organizations. So that's a heavy lift. I'm not sure how we get there.
And then one other follow-up question, just in terms of the administration of if we were to move to the video process, would that be any additional cost for PCL to take on, or is that just baked into, what we're already
We would
doing?
make it work.
Okay.
I mean, I talked it over with staff, and they felt like, to be fair, this was a more fair way, because it doesn't put so much burden on the agency to come up with a way to video people and do all that and submit it properly, and then transmission issues. So I felt like we would make it work.
Okay, all right, thank you.
But it still costs money, so.
Yes, it does. It's 3 days of staff time, and then whatever time it takes to put it into a format to send it to you all. And then it takes time, you have to have people sign up, and, there's always going to be some time, yes. So maybe a week's worth of staff time total for one FTE?
So, to me, it's a real loss not to have people in the room testifying. Even though it's been probably one of the most difficult parts for me in terms of serving on the allocation committee, is the sort of the stories and not being able to necessarily help everybody that I wish we could be helping. But I've always just really, really like seeing the faces of people who are either leading a program, are line staff with a program, or are people using the services of that program. I think is really important for all of us to have some kind of experience with that. So I definitely think I would be supportive of this video model of 2 to 3 minutes, which I know isn't much, but it's something. The one thing that I think we lose is other people in the room listening to those voices also. And I'm wondering whether these videos would be available to, on the Children's Levy website, and if programs would be comfortable with that, because I think that has a real benefit.
That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that. And yes, I think it could be, as long as we got them to release, if they were willing to release, because I think it would require a release for people to, it's their information and their face, and, if they want to make themselves publicly available. But I think, John, am I wrong? Would that be, okay. I think that's doable.
Okay.
I agree that something is lost in not having face-to-face, and I don't know what to do about that. I'm not sure what the right mechanism would be that is equal to all and fair to everybody.
And to that also, which you've spoken of, is that it gives an opportunity for as we take time in wherever we have it, to watch those. We don't have to do it in all one big block. That we can carve that up and probably be better listeners by having the luxury of doing that. So I think that has an advantage.
That was definite feedback from the committee members last time, was that 2 hours was, to your point last time, was by the end you were,
That's how.
there's so much information. Other questions or thoughts if you want to hear from folks?
Very good. Public testimony on this item. Anybody want to come on up? Great, here he is again, that masked man.
But I would say, additionally to the important items that Lisa brought out, in terms of trauma-informed, it's a lot more trauma-informed if you're not asking someone to testify here. It feels like a testimony, particularly for families in the criminal justice system. You guys are on the dais, you're looking at us. It feels like it's a court. So having videos for either the client or even staff is a lot less traumatic experience. Not everyone feels comfortable, as I do, obviously. Coming up to Mike.
Right.
Good point.
Thank you.
Very good. Anybody else want to testify on this item? Well, I'll just share Lisa's conflict in terms of how to get the balance right. Obviously, there's a desire to feel that we have respected the organizations, that we fully understand the applications that they're making, we understand the value of the services they're providing, and some of the nuances. And I certainly share with Julie, one of, not only does everybody benefit from the conversation and understand where there may be nexus opportunities or connections that would be of value to moving forward the community's agenda, but one other thing you lose through the videos is the opportunity to actually ask questions as those questions occur to you. But the practical reality is we cannot do the thorough evaluation of 70 different applications here in front of this particular body. It has to be done through other means. And I like the idea of trying the video protocol. Let's see how that works. And my suspicion is what will happen is we'll watch the videos or we'll listen to them, and it will generate additional follow-up questions. So there's probably going to have to be some sort of a protocol whereby we could ask questions of specific organizations as they're raised in the video, whether that be follow-up through email or having people be here to answer very specific questions. But there will probably need to be some sort of an iterative process.
Okay, I hadn't thought. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a good idea. Maybe we just have to build time in. That's the main thing, to build some time into the process. And we're just about to get to schedules shortly, so I'll put that in there for them.
There's no question here that the time and capacity are the limiting factors.
The one thing I would say also, Mayor, is that you level the playing field for all of the applicants by creating the system to be the same. And as this man said over here, I agree, it's less traumatic for especially the smaller organizations that are going to apply. And I think John is so talented on the video side of it. I think it will also give people the time to tell their stories, especially if we give them the framework and everything, and knowing that they don't have to come up with it, but that the levy is going to help them, I think will also inform this new process.
Okay.
So Lisa, to clarify what you're asking of the allocation committee today, you're asking for a vote to specifically support these strategies and have you continue to work on the implementation of these strategies. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we want to be able to set up the process because we need a final vote from you all so we can let everybody know what the process is.
So
Because by the
we are in
time,
fact authorizing these processes?
yes, exactly, that
Okay.
you would decide that this
Very
would be
good.
your policy. So when we go out to do the bidders conferences, et cetera, we would say there is no advocacy. That is a policy that's changed, and, this is the way you can have your input is to do written, and you can do a video testimony. We can give all of that information up front for people. And also, just for folks here, we don't imagine publishing till the fall, but people will understand, as this filters out and as the minutes and all the other, that the process has changed.
Good, and there's one other clarification I'd like to make. We changed the public process around the city's budget process this year, and we tried a couple of different strategies. And in my opinion, some of those strategies worked really well, and others I don't think worked well at all.
Oh, okay.
And so I think the way we should present this to the community is as something new and different that we are doing on a trial basis. We want to see how it works, see how effective it is, and I hope on the other side we'll get some feedback and decide whether this really works or whether we should be moving in a different direction or whether we should be refining the process that we're
You have our commitment to do that.
that
We
we're
will
voting on today.
definitely follow up with that.
If
And that's
it
provided
passes.
most of our resource in making all these shifts, right, is doing that process.
Yeah, innovation's, not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't always work exactly the way we hope.
No.
Very
had
good,
that
I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second?
We have a motion and a second, please. Well, I'll just call the roll. I forget, I don't need a council clerk here. All in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The motion carries. Thanks for your hard work.
All right, thank you.
Very good. All right, so our next item revolves around additional requests for investment revisions, and Meg McElroy is here to walk us through this. And again, we will have time for questions and public input on this item, but we are not taking a vote today.
That is correct.
Very good.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Meg.
Good afternoon. So just a reminder of timeline. As the mayor said, I'm going to introduce additional changes being proposed to the request for investment document that'll be used to solicit applications. During our last meeting, I introduced proposed changes to a section that focused on organizational capacity and equity, diversity, and inclusion in organizational approaches to their work. And today's presentation will focus on program design, proven program design, and effectiveness. And again, we'll take input through the SurveyMonkey tool that we have available and email over the next week or so before we prepare everything for your June 17th meeting. And then folks can weigh in today as well. So just to review, last time I spoke to you about kind of the major factors that are informing the changes that we're proposing to the request for investment, which I'll start calling RFI. First and foremost, we're trying to align our RFI with city equity goals as well as to emphasize our own Levy goals around reducing racial disparities in children's well-being and success. And there were major equity themes from the community engagement process that we engaged in, as well as from Portland State University's review of our grant-making process. We consulted with local private and public funders on the work that they're doing in these arenas. And we wanted to move how we approached our RFI toward asking applicants questions that best help understand their practices, addressing how families are served, and assuring that what their experiences are in their programs and the organizations are racially just, safe, and inclusive. I am going to walk you through a little bit more of the specifics and the changes in the program section in a minute, but just before I do, I want to kind of make sure that folks in the audience and you all can kind of see the big picture. So in the 2014 RFI, there were 4 main sections in the RFI, and their point values, I think everyone's got the table, but there were point values assigned to a program section that was the largest section, and it will remain so in the new proposed RFI. And then there was a budget section worth 10 points, and the new RFI will be similar. And then there was an organizational capacity section and a culturally responsive programs and organizations section. And as I reviewed last time, we have collapsed those large part to address all the things I just said, as well as to address the fact that in the previous application, the point spread for that organizational capacity section was so little, like people scored so well, that we felt like it was more important to move the points into an area where we needed to understand more discernment in organizations' capacity. And the previous RFI had bonus points for culturally specific services and for serving children that reside or attend school east of 82nd Avenue. The new proposed draft RFI moves the organizational capacity and commitment to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion section up to the front of the application so that we will hear from applicants first who that organization is and how they approach racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in their organizational practices overall. That's a 36-point proposed value for that section with a minimum required of 23 points to be considered for funding. The second section would address the proposed program that the applicant wants funded, so proven program design and effectiveness. That would be worth 54 points, which is 1 point different from before, and worth a minimum of 38 points to be considered for funding. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the specifics in a minute. And then finally, a program budget section. So we'll understand who the organization is, what they're proposing to do, and how they're going to spend the money to do it. So as I noted last time, when we retooled the organization section, it was both to emphasize questions we want to understand about organizational practices and commitment around advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it also had to do with sort of trying to streamline and focus our questions more. Those same lenses were applied in this program section change. So many of the questions were streamlined, particularly to ask applicants to address the features by program area that are emphasized in the strategy documents and that came out of our community engagement process. In particular, we've called out questions that look at an applicant's past success and experience in serving the proposed program population, evidence of the service user's voice or the family's voice in the desire to have that particular program, the diversity and reflectiveness of program staff and assuring that they have the training and development needed to address issues of program quality. And we will be moving toward the drafting of program area specific requests for investments after you all approve the template. So there are still some finer grain specifics that will come out on the features for the strategies as we get to drafting the request for investments for each program area. We simplified the language in this section to try to make it easier for applicants to understand the RFI itself and to prepare an application, and I have no doubt that there's room for additional improvement for that, so I welcome input. Again, we emphasize the racial equity, diversity, and inclusion questions in this section, particularly the population to be served, the outreach and barriers to reaching the proposed population. In the explanation for the program design section, we want to understand why this program for the population and how does the applicant know that the people they propose to serve want the program and that it will produce the outcomes that they propose to produce. And then we want to understand more about the program quality from the vantage point of program attendance, outcomes, and staff development and training. We removed the bonus points entirely from this proposed RFI and instead wove the key things that we're trying to emphasize the most into the questions themselves. And so the program section of the RFI still includes 6 subparts, and those subparts are to have a summary of the program generally and its connection to the applicant organization, a description of the population served, which asks the applicant to complete a small table as well as a larger table that went with the organization section. So there's sort of an understanding in 2 different places of the population to be served, to describe their outreach and recruitment strategies, to outline the program design itself, which is kind of our way of looking at the logic model. How many kids, what types of activities, how much attendance do you anticipate they need in order to produce outcomes, what are the outcomes, and how will this program be staffed? And then we ask applicants to to explain that design. Why is this the right program for this population you propose to serve? How do you know they want it? How do you know the outcomes will be produced the way you intend? And then the final section around program results, quality improvement, tries to ask questions asking for evidence of how they look at attendance, outcomes, and staff development through the lens of quality. And with that, I am happy to take questions. Sorry, one more note. In the way that we have constructed the new template, there are 4 additional points that are unallocated at this point in time that will be used as we draft the program area sections to emphasize any particular issues that need additional points for them because of the features that are in the program area strategies and were part of what was emphasized in community engagement. So we left that little 4-point window for each area, each particular program area, and some additional things that need to come out. Happy to take questions and very happy to hear input from folks who are here today.
I have one quick question. With the proposal for the point system, who's going to explain this to the applicants, like this whole process?
We're going to do our best to try to do that. In the past, all of that information was part of the request for investment document that went out, and we held bidders conferences, and we were available as staff to answer questions. We have looked at what other funders have been doing along the lines of trying to make their process more transparent and clear. And we feel like one thing that we haven't done in the past that we need to do is develop a frequently asked questions document.
That's what I was about to recommend.
Okay, yeah. So it's one thing for us to put it all in writing in the way that we talk. It's another thing to think about how to think about the kinds of questions that we'll get. The other thing that we wanted to try to offer this time is that as people generate questions about the RFI itself, that we have a way of posting them either on our website or by some tool and sharing that out. So we'll try to be as transparent as other people call us up or email us with a particular question so that everyone has access to those responses in some amount of real time. I'm open to any other suggestions for ways to make sure we communicate it clearly, but that's where we are right now.
I have a few questions. Meg, on page 1 of 8, under proven program design and effectiveness,
Okay.
in the first 2 sentences, we seem to be drawing a differentiation between best practice and evidence-based programming. Could you explain what the difference is?
Sure. Not every best practice has a robust, quantitative evidence base behind it. There may be documentation around promising practices. There may be qualitative documents that sort of highlight that these are practices that matter and are making a difference. But it may be that PhD level researchers haven't yet been paid to study and create an evidence base that has been peer reviewed in journal articles and the like. So evidence base is typically thought of, if we were thinking about it as a continuum of some of the most scientifically robust but also costly and intensive study in social sciences, whereas best practices may be things that have been evidence-based, but some are also emerging out of work that's happening at the grassroots or things that just haven't risen to the level of scientific study in that way.
In the last go-around, did we apply an evidence-based filter or a best practices filter or both to our analysis?
I would say both. And I think the thing that we continue to experience is applicants will propose an evidence-based practice model, for example, that maybe they've never operated before, and then discover it wasn't the great fit for the population they wanted to serve, or there were just other major challenges with implementing it to fidelity of that evidence base. So then they might make best practice tweaks to it that aren't necessarily part of that evidence base. So I think we've been kind of flexible to that definition.
So when the scorer, how does the scorer determine, and is it up to the scorer to determine whether or not it truly is a best practice?
Yes and no. The criteria for how something should be scored is pretty well outlined in the criteria. And how the applicant responds to the question, especially in the rationale section, should be walking us through, so section E, about explanation of program design, should be walking us through how the practice is intentional, has been successful, is based on experience, and that the applicant is providing evidence of those things. So yes, it'll be up to the reviewers to use the criteria that are defined here to see whether they feel like it's a compelling response. And we hope that, and you'll hear from Lisa Hansel in a minute, about the way in which we propose to recruit reviewers and the job we're asking them to do. And we're hoping that the reviewers who step up to do this work are able to bring their expertise and experience to lend in making those judgments using these criteria.
Right, so it does seem to be a judgment call.
It is, but it's also going to be based on what's on the page.
Right,
Yeah,
so I just wondered why we didn't add a specific question in E that says, please provide us the evidence that your programming is best practice. Because, I mean, if it's best practice in the eyes of the program providing it, is probably different than if it's best practice and done by lots of other programs and they're following it, which may not be peer reviewed and et cetera, but still is a best practice. So it seems like, because I look at the question, and if you go to D1, the model or standards used, if the program uses curricular or program or model standards and practices to guide its activities, which I assume they all do, but please list those in 1 to 2 sentences, but it's an optional question, right? So you could say not applicable, I guess. But
Well,
to
yeah.
me, that is, you hit the places where I think we would kind of draw out whether or not other people are using the same practices, which would be E, D1, and F2. But it just seems like it might be easier for the applicants if we kind of serve up a softball to them and say,
Okay.
you know, because it's easier to say, look, I'm not the one deciding this is a best practice. We adopted these because such and such is written about them, or such and such published them, or somebody's having great success with them.
Yes. I hear you. So I guess what I'm wondering is in section E, so I'm on page 4 of the proposed RFI text.
Yeah.
In question 3, or woven throughout this somehow, would you like to see reference to how is what you're proposing to do best practice to lead to the proposed outcomes, or best practice for this population, or kind of a both and?
Yeah, and again, take it for what it's worth, but to me, the way to make it the simplest would be for us to define what we mean by best practice. So we would include the definition right at the start of 3.
Okay.
And then we'd add a new question 5 that quoted that definition and say, can you provide us the basis for why you think you meet this definition?
Okay.
And then they wouldn't have to try to figure out what best practice means. We would have, and if we're going to connect it to evidence-based like that, I think we should have a definition for evidence-based so the applicants can clearly understand the difference. And maybe they all do, but I think that would make it really easy for them to blow through, and I think it would make it easier for the reviewers, too.
Okay.
So Mitch, I'll further complicate the question. Because then this is a really good discussion, because this is an ongoing question of what is best practice and who gets to decide what is best practice. And I hope we don't get into a situation where we have a program identified as best practice which gets lousy results.
Gets what results?
Gets lousy results.
lousy
Alternatively, what happens if you have a program that's not best practice? For example, it's a new approach, an innovative approach, and it gets really good results. Are they going to get dinged on the best practice side even though they get good results? Because frankly, I care more about the results. So maybe there's some way to combine those two.
Yes. I mean, that is kind of what is the intent behind section E at this point, is to really help us, to ask the applicant to really help us understand, why is this what you want to do? So by asking that question, somebody could point to best practice, they could point to experience and success. Those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And other rationale for why it's the right thing. But I think what I'm hearing you say is also give people an opportunity to reference best practice standards in their explanation of that, if that's what they're using.
So I really don't care if the program's best practice
You
if
want
it doesn't
results.
work.
Yeah.
Alternatively, I'm not sure I care if it's best practice if it works really well.
Okay.
I mean, so, help me reconcile those things.
I guess I thought that the way that we composed Section E as it stands now reconciles that somewhat. So it was an opportunity to, particularly, so in that section, there's 4 points in the first bullet on the criteria. So I'm on page 7 of the program section you were provided. So this is the type of tool the reviewers would use to score the application. And the first bullet there says, demonstrates evidence that the proposed program design is intentional, based on experience, and has success working with the population to be served. So you, in your explanation as an applicant, might talk about best practice there. You might talk about how, to your point, Mayor, you've been doing this program for a long time, and maybe it isn't necessarily based on best practice research, but it's getting results. The fourth bullet down demonstrates how the proposed program activities will lead to proposed outcomes. Maybe you haven't been doing this program before, but it's based on best practice philosophy. Therefore, you're making the argument that these proposed program activities are based on these standards or these practices. They have typically led to the outcomes that we plan to see in other settings. Therefore, we're proposing them here. The next one there talks about racial equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations in the explanation. So again, you might be saying something like, while these are best practices in our community, they may not be applicable to every population that we serve, but we are serving this particular population, and these are the things that we have seen prove out. These are the activities that our population wants to partake in. But I can weave in more explicit response for best practice, or we can also hear from what folks here have to say, or additional input.
So I guess I'll just put sort of a broader thought on the table, which is we've already concluded that we're going to get a lot of applications. It's going to be very complicated. We're limited in the amount of time that we have to be able to go through and cull out the programs that we'd like to fund. I'm concerned we're getting to such a finely feathered level of analysis here. I mean, we're getting down to 1 point, 2 point, and we're asking for a lot in exchange. And I'm wondering, is there a way to simplify this framework without jeopardizing what you're trying to do?
I appreciate the question. I think there's 2 things to keep in mind here. One is what we're asking the applicant to respond to. So their questions on the document you have are pages 1 through 5.
Mm-hmm.
And then the scoring criteria have to be used by reviewers to make sense of what people say in their application. And while I hear the concern about being pretty fine-grained, what the review criteria are, at the same time, it helps the reviewer try to discern what they read and do that with each application that they're being asked to score, so that they're not comparing the applications to each other, because that's not the job we're asking them to do. We're asking them to compare the application to the criteria, which is a typical approach in a process like this.
Okay, and is one of the I mean, I guess I'm trying to get the frame of reference here. Because I come into this from a perspective of I want to make sure we honor the intention of the levy and that we get very good results with the limited dollars that we have. And it feels like you've gone to great lengths to make sure the application process is fair for the providers of the services. And I want to make sure that in being diligent in that effort, which I applaud, we're not overemphasizing the fairness to the providers at the expense of the outcomes that we want in the levy.
Sure.
And I want to make sure that the outcomes don't get overwhelmed by some of these other considerations. I want to make sure that the dollars we're investing are getting good, solid outcomes.
Yes,
First and foremost.
I think we all want that.
Right.
Yes. So yes.
We do.
Yes.
But I, again, as I look at what we're asking the providers to do here, it is extremely comprehensive. And I'm just asking, is this level of detail truly necessary to get at the results? And the answer may be yes. I'm trying to be convinced.
Yes, I hear you. Well, there's two things at work, I think. There's the information that you all, well, let me back up. There's the information that the reviewers need to make sense of each given application. That results in a score. That information, along with a lot of other factors, are things then that you all have to weigh in your decision-making. The spread of services in our community, who's being served, what types of opportunities you want to see them be able to experience. And the score is one thing that helps you make that determination. Then there's what gets funded. And sometimes what gets funded scores well. It addresses many other policy considerations that you all may have, but implementation kind of goes off the rails. So we have to, as staff, support them to do the kinds of things that they said they want to do, and sometimes those programs get cut. So to your point, Mayor, I think this process does pretty well identifying the types of projects that get results, and there are those outliers that either lose funding because they don't engage the population the way they thought, or the population didn't want the service the way they thought, or there needs to be an adjustment in the service itself in order to produce the outcomes that the organization and the people want to experience. So this part of the process is certainly one step in getting to the results, but it's not the only step.
Okay.
So just to get back to the outcomes question too, Section F in the RFI, especially F2, asks the applicant to talk about, for the outcomes that they're proposing in the application itself, how they intend to measure them. And how they look at those in relationship to the quality of the program. So it's another 7 points and a lens on the outcomes piece itself.
Yes, and I value that highly, and that's a that's a priority for me, is how do you define success and how do you measure it?
Go ahead, Julie.
I have a question regarding, well, I suppose all of the entire template, but wondering whether any of these questions, some of what we're raising, were things that came up in the community engagement work. Was there input around best practices versus evidence-based, or what, any concerns voiced there?
They weren't asked the question about evidence-based versus best practice. They were asked questions that resulted in responses about the quality of the program they experience and who they see and feel delivering it to them. Okay. So their responses were more about wanting to assure a diverse workforce survey that represents their community and who they are serving them, and that the folks that are doing that work are well-equipped, trained, and supported to be successful in the work that they do. So the 400-plus people who responded to the survey and the 100-plus people involved in the focus groups did not talk about evidence-based versus best practice in the terms or ways that we use it, so much as they talked about quality and wanting to feel included and seen in the services they experience.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, good. Do we want to take some public testimony?
I'd be into that.
Lots of interesting issues here. Thanks, Meg, for your hard work.
Yeah.
Who'd like to testify?
Come on.
All right, well, so we are not taking a vote on this today, is that correct?
That is correct.
And there will still be an opportunity for people to provide testimony, and where can they do that, Meg?
Yes, and per your feedback today and any other feedback that comes in, we'll make revisions and bring it back to the next meeting.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a lot of work on your part. Thank you very much for that. Our last item centers around potential changes to the grant application review process. And Lisa Hansel is here with some options to consider. And once again, the public will be able to weigh in after the fact here after the committee's had any questions answered by Lisa that we'd like to ask. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you. So you've heard from Meg about the RFI application. Now it's time to think about the review process. Staff has proposed 2 options for your consideration. Both of these options respond to the reviewer feedback and staff feedback that was provided in 2014, as well as recent PSU recommendations. Staff will solicit public comment on the review process between now and the next allocation committee meeting and incorporate that feedback and bring that to you to the meeting on the 17th, and we'll ask for further discussion and approval at that time. So prior to this meeting, you received a copy of the recommendations related to the review process from PSU, the reviewers, and staff feedback in 2014, as well as a chart that summarizes the features in 2014 and in each option 1 and option 2. And the audience also has a copy as a handout. It's titled Recommended Changes to the Grant Review Process. The main differences between the proposed options is that with option 1, continue to have one panel of, or one set of reviewers who reviews each set of applications. With option 2, proposes splitting the reviewers, scoring, one set of reviewers would score one part of the application and another set of reviewers would score another part of the application. With both of these options, there are similar changes to the 2014 review process. For both options, there would be extensive outreach to recruit reviewers. There would be a reviewer application and screening process. Reviewers would receive more training, including practice scoring applications. There would not be the review panel meetings where reviewers discuss applications and have an opportunity to change their scores. Stipends would be offered to volunteer reviewers who aren't being compensated by their employer to do this work. And score forms would be sent to each applicant at the close of the funding process. So I think the best way to explain these is just to walk through the chart that you have and quickly just identify through each of the features, an overview of the changes and options and rationale. So the chart, it has the column headings, features, 2014 review process. Everybody have that one? Okay. So the first on the list is actual number of estimated reviewers, actual or estimated number of reviewers. You can see in 2014 there were 79 reviewers, and don't have a big variation for that for either option 1 or 2, 75 or 80. The next item, the next feature has to do with the estimated or actual number of applications. In 2014, there were 115 applications, and for option 1 and 2, we're projecting a maximum of 150 applications. Just with that broadening of the strategies, anticipate more applications than we had in 2014, and from a maximum of 75 organizations. So all the numbers that you see on this chart reflect that number of applications. So if we have fewer, it'll be adjusted. If we have more, then numbers go up.
And they don't include any kick-up for small grants, right? This is
No, this
separate.
doesn't include, yeah,
just wanted to make
the
sure.
small grants would not be included in that. Great question. With reviewer recruitment, in 2014, we really had, it was pretty much limited to staff reaching out to folks that we knew who have expertise in equity, diversity, and inclusion and/or the program areas. So that was largely done by personal invitation. With options 1 and 2, we propose a more formalized and structured reviewer recruitment and screening process to address PSU, prior reviewers, and staff recommendations. Conducting extensive outreach will make the process more inclusive and is expected to result in a larger pool of potential volunteer reviewers representing a broad cross-section of community with a balance of expertise in working with and participating in services that are funded through the levy. As part of the recruitment, a description of the reviewers' roles and responsibilities will be distributed. This will provide potential reviewers with a clear understanding of what their role and expectations are and time commitments, and this was something that was highlighted by reviewers in 2014. So really help people understand what this means. It's a very important role. And it would also increase the transparency and equity in this part of PCL's process, which was something that PSU really emphasized in their recommendations. Next would be the reviewer application and screening process. In 2014, there weren't applications, so there wasn't a screening process. With options 1 and 2, we would implement an application and screening process. Using a reviewer and application screening process will make it possible for the Levy to select reviewers with expertise and experience in PCL program areas and in racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next is reviewer training and support. In 2014, there was training for all of the reviewers. However, we didn't have a practice session included as part of that training. And for options 1 and 2, we would continue to do training and include time for practicing, giving guidance and practice scoring applications. Additionally, midway through the process, staff would individually contact each reviewer, check in, see if they had questions about the applications or scoring, and assess their progress in completing their reviews. The difference in training between option 1 and 2 is that with option 2, there would be 2 distinct training sessions, one really focusing on the organization and equity, diversity, inclusion section, and one training for those reviewers who would be reviewing the program and budget section. The enhanced training will support volunteer reviewers and is in direct response to 2014 reviewer and staff feedback. And we believe that the additional training and support will likely result in increased inter-rater reliability as well as overall scoring quality. Next on the list is the applications section scored, and this is where the biggest difference comes in the 2 options. The first one would, in 2014, in option 1, reviewers read and score all sections, the same set of reviewers review all sections of the application. And the advantage to this option is that it assures that the reviewers gain a full understanding of both the organization and the proposed program. The disadvantage with this is that for many organizations submit more than one application, so that means that different sets of reviewers review and score the organization section of the application. Just to give you so then they end up with multiple scores there. So some programs would have 5 reviewers scoring an application and their program section, and others would have maybe 15 different reviewers scoring that organization section. To give you some perspective on it, in 2014, 24 organizations submitted more than one organization, accounting for 77 of the 115 applications. This duplicates reviewer effort and requires staff time to average results from the multiple review panels or groups of reviewers. It's complicated, but option 2 would have 2 different sets of reviewers, one reviewing the organization equity, diversity, and inclusion section, and another set reviewing the program and budget section. Let's see, and then with the program budget reviewers, we would ask that they review the full application so that they do have an understanding of the organizational capacity and equity, diversity, and inclusion, so they'd be able to gauge the feasibility of the program that they're proposing.
Lisa, which seems to make it even more redundant than the problem we're
other
trying to
piece.
get away from. That's the only thing that confused me is, yes, you could say there's a difference between reading and scoring, but I think most people, if they read it, it's as good as scored in the sense that if they're taking time to read the section. So it just seemed like we were trying to solve a redundancy problem by creating more redundancy.
It is true that 2 sets of reviewers would need to review the information. I think the advantage to this is that you would have people with expertise in those that's the thing that you're trading off. Do you want people with expertise in equity, diversity, and inclusion reviewing that section of the application, and program and budget expertise being reviewed by another set of of reviewers.
Yeah. And did we find that our last couple of sets of reviewers were deficient in DEI understanding or qualifications?
I don't know that I would say deficient. I mean, we didn't notice issues. But I think that, I mean, we did have a balance on each of the panels. But the difference would be that all 5 of the people would have that expertise and experience and interest in.
Right. I mean,
So,
it just seems like.
so it's,
It seems odd that any high-quality program, any expert associated with any one of our fields where we fund would have a lack of understanding of DEI, but I suppose that's possible.
So,
yeah, I think it's, go ahead.
I was going to say, to piggyback sort of, I guess for me, as someone that's done a review process where I've seen the whole entire application, I'm supposed to score the application. And as someone that's only done a section of an application personally myself, I find as the reviewer, when I don't have the whole entire application, I feel, this is me personally, I feel like I'm not giving that organization the fairness it deserves because I'm going to review only such a small subset of the overall application. I feel like when I have the overall application, I feel like I'm doing the best justice for the actual organization. So I'm thinking about it through the lens of the organization. So I see how we're trying to be, as I call it, as fair as possible, but I found that when a reviewer isn't giving the whole entire application, and I've had this in feedbacks before, it's actually difficult because you're asking us to just review a subsection, but it's really hard when you don't have the context. Because when the applicant is putting the application forward, 9 times out of 10, when you are the grant writer, you're thinking you're writing to an audience that's going to view it in its whole context. So I do want to give that feedback. So,
Okay.
But-
Those are great points.
Sorry, I just had a question. I thought that the option 2, they did get to see the whole application, they just didn't get to score the whole application.
Right, for option 2 with
Okay.
the program and budget, we hadn't envisioned I mean, certainly both of the reviewer groups could have the full application. We felt like with the organizational capacity and equity, diversity, and inclusion, we would be asking the reviewers really to look at that at an organizational level and not be asking for their input on the program side of things. And so we didn't feel like that would be necessary. It certainly could be offered if that seemed more appropriate for the reviewers that would be doing that set. And these are two options, and so either,
Lisa,
open
what
to
problem
feedback.
are you trying to solve here?
The problem that we were trying to solve was the scoring difference, so versus the need to have reviewers score, in some cases, 10 different reviewers scoring the same organization section. Also, so we were trying to solve for that issue that came up the last time around. The other thing that we saw with this option 2 is having an opportunity to build relationship with folks in the community who may want to continue working with the Levy on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, and possibly become part of a advisory council, as PSU had recommended. And so we thought of that as a potential opportunity to do that. And that's not to say that we couldn't try to build that with option 1 as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure that what you're proposing in option 2 actually achieves those goals, or at least I don't see that as necessarily being the best way to do it. And I agree with what Felicia just said. I think it's very, very hard without the context. And the commissioner just said, well, but they're going to read the whole application anyway, so they'll have the context, which then leads me to ask the question, how much time or energy is actually being saved? I mean, do you have a sense of that? I mean, if I'm a diligent reviewer and I'm going to read the whole application anyway, I'm not scoring some part of it. What has actually been saved? I can't quantify that, having never done it.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, I think that, I mean, maybe you save a half an hour. I mean, I can't even quantify for you how long it actually takes a reviewer to review an application, and I'm sure that there's variance amongst reviewers. Because we haven't asked people to track that. We've only estimated what we think it would take to review an application.
I don't know if anybody else has. I've actually been a reviewer for the Children's Levy, so I can talk about it.
That'd be helpful.
Is I found, for me, because I took it very, very seriously and I wanted to put the best foot forward for every application I was scoring, I didn't only read the application, but I would go on their websites to learn anything I could do. I would look at annual reports. I would do everything I could to get a holistic perspective of the actual organization I was reviewing, to put the best foot forward. So I would say, and if I had questions, I would ask anybody on the Levy staff as well, and then I would go through and do the point system.
More questions, or move on to the next?
Well, I know who I'm going to defer to on this issue.
And I
Another
guess
expert in the room.
my question to you, Felicia, is how long did that take per application? I mean, do you have any idea?
Well, we were each, at least I was given 5, I think, applications. It's been so long, either 5 or 7. And I'm going to be honest, I took a full, anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half on the application process itself. And part of it, it's a lot of money. And it's a game changer for organizations. So I didn't feel like rushing the process was an option for me. And if I didn't understand something, I didn't just say I didn't understand. I would actually ask Levy staff, because I think that's really, really important. So I could put the best foot forward. And if an organization came back to me, I could explain why I gave the points I gave as well. So I wanted to make sure that I did my due diligence as well.
And if I'm reading between the lines here, and I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth, it sounds like you're not a big fan of option 2. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, I'm not a fan of option 2 as a former reviewer. I think
Okay, good.
option 2 is difficult to be fair, I guess. It's to me, it's about fairness for every applicant. And I think when you're a grant reviewer, like right now I'm doing the construction excise tax grant application. So I'm saying that is if I didn't have the whole entire application as I'm going through the review process, I think it would be really hard for me to only have a section. And I think anybody else, any other grant I've ever done, I've always had the whole application except for 4 times. And those were the most difficult because I was like, am I being fair? And so, because you're tempted to read the whole application, like Jessica said, but you can't score those pieces. And so, yeah, I think option 2 is just difficult to be fair.
So I have a question about the scoring related to organizational, the capacity and the DEI work and that. It's really looking at the organization versus the program. So in the past, am I hearing that because those would be read by several different people, that then the staff would have to average out how many points the organization had in that part?
Yes, so if
So
you
moving forward, then that would impact, so if they were applying under, like, they had 6 different programs that they were seeking support for, but that, whatever score was aggregated or averaged out would be that score then for that organization on all of those, under that.
That's how we did it,
Is that right?
Yes. That's
Okay.
how we did it.
So for organizations that submitted in every program area, they got 1 score on the
On the
organization.
organization
that part.
section, and
Okay.
that was added to every total. Does that make sense? So if
Okay.
you have 4 sections,
Yeah.
you've got 4 sets of scores, and those all have to be added up. Those are averaged among reviewers, but we're averaging
Okay.
for a much bigger group of reviewers
Right.
for the applications, for organizations that are
Multiple.
submitting multiple applications. So some applications are getting reviewed by many more people, in essence, that
15
section,
Yes,
than others.
that's what- right.
So that's the difference.
And so were there great differences in those scores?
Depends.
Depends,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Sometimes.
So
Sometimes.
Sometimes no. I mean,
Yeah,
it depends on the group of reviewers, right? You've got many different groups of reviewers doing, in order to parcel out this work, it's many different groups of reviewers.
Sure, absolutely.
That's
So
why
this-
we average.
This is a very good conversation, and I don't want to shut it down, but I also want to be mindful of the fact that I have a heart out at 4, and that probably applies to some other people as well.
Okay.
So maybe you could give us a quick run-through on the remainder of these, and if my colleagues have any further questions that they specifically want to raise before we get to public testimony.
Okay, let's see. I think the most important, I mean, we've talked about the time that it takes to review, length of time to score the applications. In 2014, there were 4 to 6 weeks. This time, we're looking at 5 to 9 weeks, and that will be narrowed down further once we decide things like how long testimony and the other pieces. Another primary difference is that in 2014, we had the review panel meetings where the reviewers for each set of applications would come together and discuss the applications and then have an opportunity to change their scores if they believe that needed to happen. We would not be, in both of these options, we would not have the review panel meetings. And that primarily was there were difficulties to schedule those meetings. Limited meeting time meant that not each of the applications there wasn't enough time to really discuss things, and reviewers tended not to really change their scores, so didn't feel like that needed to continue. Instead would meet with the reviewers individually after to collect their score sheets, and also have them complete a survey to get reviewer feedback, as was done in the past. And with, another big difference is that we would see offering stipends for both of these options. The only difference would be how they would be structured. If it was with option 1, $25 per application, and with option 2 would be a flat rate of $250 per reviewer, which ultimately comes out to about the same. The total cost for option 1 would be no more than $18,750, and the maximum for option 2 would be $20,000. And again, that would only be offered to people who weren't being reimbursed by their organization for that time. The other primary difference is that in the past, these score sheets were provided to any applicant who requested their score sheets. And this time around, for transparency and around the score sheets, every applicant would receive a copy of their score sheets at the conclusion of the funding process.
But was that a question about that, and thinking about our earlier conversation about what we're going to provide to the applicants? And I think there was a consensus to build in an opportunity to provide written comments after they've been scored.
Right.
And so it jogged I guess I wondered when we said we're going to provide them at the end of the funding process, aren't we going to provide them before we make a final decision? So that, what is it that we were going to provide to the applicants that they're going to use to decide whether they want to provide a written response?
So the staff thought around that is that what the applicants would be provided is the staff recommendation, and not the score sheets at that point in time.
And what's the logic on that?
You guys want to help with that? 'Cause that was.
With 115 reviewers and 5 reviewers per application, our ability to both turn around every single applicant's reviewer feedback forms and provide them with the opportunity for written feedback in response to our funding recommendation just seemed like a greater capacity than we have in that short amount of time. There's typically, between when we release funding recommendations to you all and when you make decisions, maybe a week, 2 if we're lucky. And so the demand for providing, I shouldn't say the demand, in the past we have responded to people's requests for their review forms after funding decisions and by request. And so if we were going to provide them to everybody in advance of your funding recommendations, it's just a lot to make sure we have the capacity to produce and before you all meet. The other side of that is sometimes it's difficult to see the range of scores on a review, on a set of reviewers. And so if you all want to have the opportunity for applicants to come forward and, well, I guess if they're only having written testimony, provide in their written testimony arguments about their application based on the range of scores that a set of reviewers gave them, then that's up to you. But that isn't typically information that you have had prior to decision-making in the past. You have typically had our funding recommendations, a summary of the application, and whatever testimony people gave to you in the meetings at the time.
Right, but we're talking about changing that. So I guess it's a tough call. I like the transparency. When we filter why, there's 3 steps in the weigh-in. The applicants get scored, the staff makes its recommendation, and then we decide / make a recommendation to City Hall. So I guess the question is, and it doesn't need to be decided today, what information are we going to provide to programs, and I'm thinking mostly of the ones that scored low, to allow them to provide valuable feedback to us in time for us to consider that before we make our decision, which includes evaluating both the scoring and the staff recommendation, and now a third component, which I think is good, which is a program that is either on the cusp or not looking promising or has not been recommended by staff to say, yes, but. So I'm sure there's challenges there, but for me, the more transparent it is and the more we just turn over raw scoring rather than opinions and make it opaque in terms of why is staff not recommending it, I think that would be better. It may just be too cumbersome, I don't know, but I'd sure like to have you guys think about that.
Yeah, I guess my only other question back to you all would be, is having each of the reviewers' 5 scores as opposed to the average score on the application across those reviewers going to be something that seems like of high value when it comes to decision-making to hear an applicant's pushback on staff's recommendation? I don't expect you to answer that right now, but I think that's a question to mull over as we consider whether staff making sure every single applicant has all of their completed review forms before you all make decisions is going to provide you with that additional piece of consideration. We can still give you the scores themselves across 5 reviewers, and do you want every applicant to have their forms? But
One thing I think we can do is mock up the timeline for you all, so you could maybe see what we think that would take. Because we're playing with a variety of timelines, because there's many different moving parts. And so, given you've made now a couple of decisions that will help us sketch out better what the periods could be, so that we can give that to you at the next one, when you're at the next meeting, so you could kind of judge, do you feel it's valuable enough to extend the time this much, if that's how much time we think it's going to likely take, to make sure that everybody gets that information in enough time to respond to it, given the schedule. So would that be helpful?
Sure would for me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just one other thing, I'm sorry. But thinking about all this scoring, I'm reminded that we are going to be in the market for somebody to help with the small grants program, and I think we're all expecting that person to have a very high DEI IQ. And I'm thinking about staff scoring, and it seems like it might be something we want to think about to make sure we have enough time for that person to be involved in looking at the DEI sections of all of our applicants and using that expertise broader than just the small grants. It's not a
Possibly.
recommendation,
We're not
just-
scoring the applications, just to be clear, right? So we're
Right.
looking at
You're
what the
making
scores are,
recommendations.
and then we're using usually a set of criteria, and we're making rationales. And for the most part, staff's recommendations are typically for high scoring unless there's a real exception. So that's, we're trying to step to the side mostly, but.
Public testimony. Coming up. Anybody else?
I just wanted to ask a question about criteria for DEI, J, we use the word J, justice, in our organization. I represent 25,000 children of incarcerated parents. Now, granted, there's disproportionality in terms of race and economic status in that group, but there's a whole lot of white folks and invisible children, and perhaps potentially the most marginalized population because you can't see it, you can't know it, and it's all self-review. So the kind of multiple barriers that they face, and I commend you for including refugee status or immigration status and disability status, but as the DEIJ field is emerging, those of us in the criminal justice field are advocating for a lens that takes that into consideration as well. So I would just advocate for that.
Good feedback. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, so we're not taking a vote on this, obviously. We'll take a vote on this on the 17th. And again, if anybody would like to provide additional feedback, that's certainly acceptable. And this will be posted both on the database as well as on the website for the Children's Levy, if anybody wants to take a harder look at that. Thank you to the staff for all of your hard work on this. We appreciate it. Thank you to my colleagues. We stand adjourned.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yes.